In this podcast, I want to talk to you a little bit about calling and vocation. I hope it doesn't surprise you to hear that our work, what we do with our time, really matters to God. We were created to work, to contribute to the stewardship of God's creation, to bring blessing to our communities, and to participate in the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan. Now, I believe that while God may call some people to particular vocations or careers, he certainly does call all of us to a life of following Jesus Christ. Romans 1:6 clearly identifies the Christian recipients of that letter as those who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. And that calling includes you and me. We must never make the mistake of thinking that what we do matters more than who we are. We may discover, in fact, that our paid work is actually not the most important thing that God is calling us to do. Instead, God's priority might be our parenting or our marriage, or our service in the community, or our caring for an elderly or disabled relative. Our paid work is clearly important, and we should obviously serve in our profession to the glory of Jesus Christ, but it may not necessarily be God's highest priority in our life. And God sometimes leads people to a change of direction, either within that career or sometimes to a totally different career. My experience is that God sometimes redirects people in very specific ways. In my world as a cross-cultural missionary, I meet a lot of people who have experienced that kind of dramatic redirection, or they would use the word dramatic calling. I myself experienced something similar. Post-university, I was working as a forest manager in Scotland. In my spare time, I was serving in my local church in youth and children's work, and had absolutely no interest whatsoever in overseas cross-cultural missionary work. My desire, in the words of 1 Chronicles 28:20, was to be strong and courageous and do the work. And for me, that work was being part of an evangelistic and discipleship team amongst the young people of Forfar, a small town north of Dundee. During that work, I met Sarah, and she was trained to be a teacher. She felt called to be a missionary in Peru, and she was looking for a husband to accompany her. And God brought us together. But it made no sense to Sarah. This guy had no interest at all in the very thing that she felt God was calling her to do. But God then redirected us both dramatically. Began in 1996 when I was in a church in Cambridge, and I had an experience of God clearly speaking to me through an elderly man about going to China to tell people about Jesus. God then confirmed it through suddenly bringing many Chinese students to our church and developing in us both a love for the Chinese people. The next step was giving up our jobs and beginning to study at Bible college, where we developed an interest in Islam and a desire to share the gospel with Muslims. Sarah and I then took a vision trip to the Philippines with OMF for about 6 weeks, and we visited all sorts of work, tribal work and work amongst the urban poor and work amongst Chinese. And we liked all of it, and we could see ourselves doing any of it. But neither of us was satisfied that that constituted a clear call from God. So on that last weekend in Manila, I was reading this book called When God Guides. And I read about a guy who was working amongst Chinese, and the verse that God had used to call him was 1 Chronicles 28:20. That very verse that God had used to call me into youth work. Was that just a coincidence? Was I looking for something that wasn't there? Or was it God speaking? I didn't know. And I cried out and I wrote in my diary, Lord, one more time from your word, and we will apply to OMF without delay. The final Sunday, the next day, in fact, was in Manila, was in a Chinese church, and the notice sheet was handed out. And I saw that the text for that Sunday sermon was 1 Chronicles 28. And the subject of the sermon was this: the grace of giving, not just giving your money, but giving yourself to the work of the Lord. And at the end of the sermon, Sarah turned to me and said, "Oh, that verse 20 really struck me." God had spoken clearly, directly, and unmistakably to both of us. And frankly, nothing's been the same ever since. Now, perhaps God doesn't always speak as clearly or as directly as that, but he is our Father. He is a God who guides. He is a God who leads and who cares about how we spend our time. But his primary concern is that we know that we are his, that we're called to belong to Jesus Christ. So serve him in whatever your hand finds to do, but wait upon him expectantly if you feel that he may be leading you to a change in direction. And take the opportunity to share and to pray with other Christians in your community as you wait. I pray that God would bless you and would lead each of you in fulfilling the calling he's placed upon your life. Thank you.